This is a personal record of a recent trip that Susan and I took from Lisbon, Portugal to Toledo, Spain, staying at several pousadas and padores in those two countries. Here are the 15 people who we traveled with, along with our trip leader, Yame Romero, after we spent 3 days on our own in Lisbon. Our first 5 days are in Lisbon. We check into the Turim Marquês Hotel near the northern part of the center of the city. Marquês de Pombal plays an important role in the city, and there's quite a bit named after him. We begin in the Plaza of Commerce near the waterfront. The statue in the center is of King Jose. He was smart enough to hire Pombal after the earthquake of 1755, and it was Pombal who did the most to redesign the city. Passing through this arc, we enter the neighborhood called the Baija. It's really the shopping district of the town. In this district, you can see the rectangular grid layout that Pombal introduced. Walking through, you notice the tiled fronts of the buildings and the beautiful basalt stone sidewalks. The neighborhood to the west of the Baija is the Barrio Alto. It's hilly and you need a funicular to get up the hills. It's also an area with a lot of interesting shops, restaurants, and entertainments, and especially beautiful views of the city. Another area that we explored was along the waterfront to the west of the city. One of the first sights we saw here was the Monastery of Geronimus with its Manueline architecture. It's a beautiful interior, also contains some famous tombs, including that of Vasco da Gama. After visiting the monastery, we stopped at Patis de Belém for some of their delicious custard tarts. Then we went to the LX factory, where factory buildings had been repurposed into interesting shops and restaurants. There we had lunch of cod fritters made from the salted, dried cod that the Portuguese seem to love. We also visited the Museum of Antique Arts, where we saw a picture by Bosch and some interesting furniture dating from the 15th century. Another museum is the Gulbenkian, whose masterworks include works by Rembrandt and many other famous painters. On our third day in Lisbon, we join up with our group of 14 other folks for our travels through the city. Our first stop is in the Alfama district. That's to the east of the city center, and it's the old area of sailors and the area that was inhabited primarily by Muslims back in the day. It has narrow, twisting streets and many beautiful viewpoints. We then took a trip with our group to the northwest of the city, to the city of Sintra, where we visited the castle that dated back from Moorish times in the 10th century. The palace features beautifully tiled rooms and even a huge kitchen with giant smokestack to carry away the steam and heat. After visiting the palace, we were introduced to the local favorite ginger.
The story about this drink is introduced by the monks in the Middle Age. At the beginning, it's good for health. It's anti-inflammatory and give you some strength to work in the land. And that's how it born that beautiful fruit we call sour cherry. We call ginger. It's a sour cherry. It's a wild cherry.
After leaving Sintra, we drove along the coast all the way back to the east toward Lisbon, stopping to visit the Tower of Belém and the Discovery Monument. In the evening, we rode by tram up to the Barrio Alto to have our welcome dinner, during which we were entertained by fado singers. On our way from Lisbon to our first stop at the Pousada in Évora, we make stops at 3 places to view industries that are very important to Portugal: tiles, cheese, and cork. Our first stop is at Azalea, a towel, where we're going to stop at a tile factory. We view artisans working on tile. The man in the background is doing a large set of tiles that will then be fired to come out to a beautiful blue, while the man in front is working on an individual tile. We had a chance to try our hand at tile decorating, and here you see Sue and her work, and also here is the work of all of us, which we got at the end of our trip. Next, we head up the road to visit a cheese-making operation.
And you watch everybody put your ring into your hand like this. Lift up your rings, shake, shake, shake. Look at the camera and say, cheese, cheese.
Now we have an opportunity to enjoy the fruits of our labors with a fine meal of cheese. Here's a picture of Phil and Jaume outside the cheese factory. On the way to our third stop, we passed many cork trees, orchards of cork oak. You notice that the trees have numbers on them, and those numbers tell the year, the last digit of the year in which they were harvested. They can only be harvested once in 9 years. After removing the bark from the trees, the cork is cut into long strips and set out to dry.
And the first thing that we do when we have the cork completely dried, it's grabbing that cork and sticking it inside of water. But cork is waterproof, as I told you, it will not absorb.
Traditionally, cork was used in wine bottles, but when New Zealand changed to screw-on tops, they had to come up with new uses for cork. Now we drive on to our first posada in Évora. This is at the convent, which is actually a monastery of St. John the Evangelist, founded in 1485. The rooms are the old cells of the monks, and these rooms are on the second floor around a courtyard, a beautiful courtyard. And we ate our meals down in the lower level around the courtyard. Monastery lies on the top of a hill in Évora and is surrounded by all kinds of interesting architecture. This Temple of Diana dates from Roman times. It had been converted in the 18th or 19th century into a building, but was recently renovated back to its current form. This tower from the Visigothic era, probably in the 500s, was converted by the Moors after their invasion in 711. And it's just part of the beautiful architecture in the area that surrounds the monastery, Roman, Moorish, as well as Renaissance. In our walk around town, we enjoyed the town square, but especially also the university students in their academic garb. Évora's Church of St. Francis contains an ossuary with bones from monks and others in the past. The Cathedral of Évora, near our monastery where we stayed, was built in the 1300s, and it's a mix of Romanesque and Gothic architecture. After our walk through Evora, we went to the Portuguese cooking school, where we learned how to whip eggs into custard, to make baked apples, and to cut pork for one of the dishes. Here, one of our fellow travelers is scoring some chorizo for an interesting delight to be cooked in this dish.
Okay. And now, Nancy, you are going to wait a minute. Give it a minute, and Nancy.
We enjoyed a wonderful multi-course lunch, and then thanked our cooking teachers, Sophia's son, and Maria, for teaching us. Our 2-day stay in Evora comes to a close with a beautiful sunset. We leave our posada in Evora to travel to our next stop in Carmona, Spain. Halfway through, we stop in Merida. Merida is the former Roman city of Augusta Emerita, established in 25 BC to house retired soldiers, especially those who had helped win Spain. We toured the Colosseum, the amphitheater, which had been built in 16 BC, and other nearby ruins. It turns out that after the fall of Rome, the civilizations after used the stones almost as a quarry from the amphitheater and Colosseum to build their buildings. After lunch at a cafe which had a certain Roman look, we went to the Roman Museum of Merita, which contained a lot of artifacts found on the site. Among them was this bust of Caesar Augustus with a pair of real Schmidt ears. We left Merida in the late afternoon to travel to our parador in Carmona. This parador, which had been built originally in the 12th or 13th century and used as a Moorish fortress, had then later been used as a pleasure palace by one of the kings of Spain. This palace, which sat on a high hill overlooking a valley, was beautifully restored and a very comfortable place for us to stay. Early on a misty morning, we drove back a few miles to Seville and drove along the Guadalquivir River, meaning Rio Grande, to view several of the buildings there in Seville, including the Bull Ring. We viewed a replica of a ship, the Victoria, that had first circumnavigated the globe, and a 12th century Moorish tower right along the river. Our first stop was at the Spanish Pavilion, built in 1929 for a Pan American exposition in that year. The pavilion honored Spanish authors and scholars and contained several niches for the different states of Spain. We next walked with our guide through this Jewish quarter and stopped at a cafe. Wait a minute, was this a cafe or a yaman, ham store? The ultimate goal of our walk was to visit the Cathedral of Seville. Seville had been a Moorish capital, established in 712 before being reconquered by the Catholic kings in 1248. The Great Mosque was completed in 1198, and it contained over 160,000 square feet, including a minaret and a courtyard for ablution or washing. After the reconquest of 1248, the mosque was converted to a cathedral and rebuilt. The minaret tower became the bell tower, and the Renaissance turret was added later. The cathedral was reconstructed to today's form during the 15th century, and yet they still preserve the courtyard. It's the largest Gothic cathedral in Europe and perhaps the world. Along with its spectacular altar and its many beautiful side chapels, it also contains the tomb of Christopher Columbus. After returning from Seville, we go down to the garden beneath the Padori and enjoy the sunset at an overlook. It's a foggy morning when we leave Carmona to drive to our parador in Ronda. But before we get there, we stop at Concha's Bull Farm to learn more about the controversial topic of bullfighting. Concha is part of a family that has raised bulls for bullfighting for many years. She reported that in spite of the fact that most bulls are killed at the end of a fight, this is still a humane way to raise animals, perhaps even more humane than raising them for food. They live a peaceful life for 4 years, are well fed, and are not subjected to any kind of mistreatment or even learning how to fight when they grow up on the farm. Concha reported that there's been a decline in interest in bullfighting, and it's very difficult to raise these animals efficiently. When they sell animals for a bull ring, they sell 8 at a time, 6 of which go into the fight. 3 matadors fight 2 bulls each, and 2 are held in reserve. So with some decline in interest in bullfighting, it's now become a tough way of life to raise bulls. Concha showed us the bull ring, where bullfighters come in to actually fight cows, not bulls. They're trying to determine which are the best cows to use for breeding. Here I wonder, what have I gotten myself into? We continued our discussion of this controversial topic over a delicious lunch. But in spite of the fact that a brave bull who puts on a great fight is occasionally saved to be used for stud, we didn't change our opinion of this sport. We leave the bull farm to drive to Ronda with a brief stop at the beautiful Andalusian white town of Zahara la Sierra. The Parador of Ronda is the former city hall dating back to 1761. It sits situated on the edge of a gorge, and as you see in this picture, the view from our room was beautiful. Our local guide Caroline led us on a walk through Ronda. We began at a viewpoint where we could look back on our Parador on the bridge over the gorge, and then we could turn around and view the gorge from the other direction. We walked through the old town, stopping at a church that had formerly been a mosque. Then we encountered an interesting character, Julio, a woodworker who made little chairs for resale. He showed us a picture that showed how lovely he looked as a young man. We continued on to a viewpoint where we could see the entire valley, and then we saw the old Church of St. Mary's at the old city square. We saw Julio again, who'd set up his sails. We continued our walk to the convent of the cloistered Carmelite nuns, who sold us cookies on this roundabout where we could pass the change and they delivered the cookies. We next came to 2 famous expats, Orson Welles and Ernest Hemingway, who had stayed in Ronda. We then encountered the Ronda Bull Ring, the oldest in Spain. Beautiful facility, which also honors one of the famous bullfighters. In the evening, several of us enjoyed a concert by the classical guitarist Paco Seco. What a wonderful way to finish our stay in beautiful Ronda. We're traveling from Ronda to the next padore in Ubeda, but passing first through Cordoba. We cross the Roman bridge into the old city of Cordoba. At one time in the year 1000 AD, Cordoba's population was just about 400,000 people. It's a beautiful old city with narrow streets and especially a wonderful mosque that has been turned into a cathedral. We enter along the outside walls of the mosque, passing one of the gateways, and we're going into the old city first. We see these narrow streets, and here's a picture of our group in the city. At one time, Cordoba had been a Jewish center, as is evidenced by this statue of the great leader Maimonides. We enter this huge mosque, which has been converted to a Catholic cathedral, but not destroyed. It was originally a Visigothic Catholic church. And in fact, for a while after the 7-11, when the Muslims took over, it was shared between Muslim and Christians. But the Great Mosque was first constructed in 785 and extended several times up through the 10th century. Cordoba was reconquered by the Christian kings in 1236, and the mosque was converted to a cathedral, but remained virtually unchanged until the Renaissance, when a nave and a transept were built dead in the center of the building. We passed through the beautiful space of the mosque, and eventually we found our way into the Catholic Church itself, which was in the center. We did find it somewhat unsettling to go from the peaceful, meditative mosque into the over-decorated, almost Baroque sanctuary of the church. In the late afternoon, we leave Cordoba to drive to our posada. It had been built in the early 1500s as the home of the Dean of the Cathedral of Malaga, and it's surrounded by beautiful Renaissance buildings. The interior retains that Renaissance style, but with a great deal of comfort as well. We are spending a day in the life of folks who work in the olive oil industry. Spain is one of the world's largest producers of olives and olive oil, producing almost 45% of the world's olives. In fact, 300,000 acres of olive trees are planted in Spain, the largest man-made forest in the world. The olives are ripe and ready to be picked, and we try our hand at doing that, using the old-fashioned method of beating them off the trees. Of course, modern pickers are mechanical, and they actually grab the trees and shake them and drop the olives down into large nets. The traditional method for creating olive oil was to first use a horse-driven crusher to crush the olives in pits, and then filter it all through a screw-driven press. The modern method of creating olive oil is to drive a truck full of the olives and leaves and deposit them in a pit. A conveyor carries the olives and debris out of the pit up into the machine. The olives and debris are separated by a blower, and then the leaves and other debris come down and are carried by a conveyor up and out to a container that then carries them off to be used for animal feed. Meanwhile, the olives are washed and tumbled. Then moved by conveyor up to a machine where they are in fact weighed. After weighing, olives are carried up further to eventually be processed in the plant. The olives are first crushed mechanically, and then they're separated, the olive material from the pits. This is then centrifuged in order to separate the olive oil from water, and the oil is eventually filtered and can be packaged. At this point, the olive oil is graded, and it can be either graded as extra virgin or just regular. The ordinary oil is then sent to Italy, where it's reprocessed chemically and is sold as light olive oil. We enjoyed tasting the olive oil, but especially then eating tapas that are prepared using olive oil. We returned to Ubeda, and after a brief rest at the Parador, we went off for a walk about town. We visited a synagogue, not actually a working synagogue, but one that had been recovered through a project that went on in town. It turns out that a developer had purchased a large block of apartments with offices and businesses on the bottom floor, and he planned to convert them into modern apartments with some modern shopping space down on the ground floor. As he began tearing out walls and doing some reconstruction work, they discovered the remains of an old synagogue. The work continued, and he removed several layers of rubble from, in fact, 2 levels below the ground level, and eventually uncovered a baking area as well as a mikvah, that is a ritual water bath space in the basement. The developer then opened this space up as a museum, and while they don't know for sure, they venture a guess that the demise of the synagogue in the future might have been due to the Inquisition, because the building right next to this block actually had a seal of the Inquisition on the front of the building. We continued our walk back through Ubeda, and one of the interesting things we noted was this graffiti on the city hall that had been placed there by college students, probably several hundred years ago, on their graduation from the college. Dusk was just settling in, and we were fortunate enough to stop in the Senior Citizen Center to hear some of the seniors practicing for their Christmas program, bringing an end to our second day in Ubeda. We have a long trip between our Parador in Ubeda and our last stop in Toledo, but we have a comfortable bus to ride in with an excellent driver, Antonio, to take good care of us. We make a couple of stops along the way, the first at Cafe Pepe, a somewhat controversial place with a lot of stuff related to Franco and the fascist regime. A little later, our second stop is in Puerto Lapis, where we see a lot of Cervantes' Don Quixote. In fact, along the way, we run into a bunch of the windmills that he was tilting at. We get our first view of Toledo. What a beautiful city. You'll notice the large quadrangle-shaped building in the center of the picture. Well, our hotel was right across the street from that building. Unfortunately, almost all of the places we stayed were at the top of the hill, which was fine going down, but less fine coming back. After getting settled in our hotel, Our local guide Carlos leads us on a walk through the narrow streets of Toledo. One of our first stops is at the Church of St. Thomas, where we view this famous work of El Greco, called The Burial of the Count of Orgaz. Carlos points out how we can see El Greco himself, the seventh from the left in this picture, along with his young son who's in the forefront. There is a tremendous amount of religious symbolism in this 16th century piece of art. Before we return to our hotel, we stop at the Cathedral of Toledo, which Sue and I will visit another day. On the next day, we go to Madrid, where our local guide Alberto takes us through the Prado. There we learn much from him about artists like Bosch, Tintoretto, and Velasquez, and the wonderful works which are in this beautiful museum. After leaving the Prado, our bus drops us off near one of the main streets of Madrid. We walk down past these beautiful buildings and onto some of the magnificent squares in this city. We encounter this interesting hotel called the Posada Payene, meaning Hotel of the Comb. Our trip leader Jaume reports that traditionally a comb had been left on a chain in a hotel room when there was not a bathroom there, and the people used the comb to comb their hair because they couldn't wash it. Well, that's sort of disgusting, isn't it? We next step at a restaurant called El Pato Mudo, meaning the dumb duck, for a lunch of paella. Our group was lucky to try 3 different paellas: a seafood, a black squid ink paella, and a Valencian paella containing chicken and rabbit. After lunch, Susan and I walked back to the Reina Sofia Museum, a modern art museum where we could see works by Salvador Dali, by Andrew Calder, the mobilist, but most especially to see Guernica, the famous painting by Picasso where he illustrated the bombing of the Spanish city during the Civil War in the 1930s. We returned from Madrid to Toledo on a fast train. We begin our last full day in Toledo with a flamenco demonstration. After the flamenco, we head out for a walk about town. We spend most of our time at the Cathedral of Toledo. It has beautiful interior. It's probably the oldest Gothic cathedral in Spain, and it's really ornately fitted out. The sacristy, which has a fantastic ceiling fresco, along with another one of El Greco's famous paintings, as well as a Caravaggio. This is truly a beautiful space. We walk back past some of the shops in town. The sword shop, of which we saw many in town, a fashion store with beautiful European fashions, and finally a jeweler, where the jeweler taps into a metal object to inlay fine metal thread, making damascene jewelry. This brings our time in Toledo as well as our total trip to a close. as we say farewell to each other at our farewell dinner. As our trip has ended, we can reflect back on the wonderful things we have seen, the history we have learned, and the people we have come to appreciate, the beautiful places in which we've stayed, and especially the friends that we've met along the way. We also appreciate the wonderful group of guides who taught us so much as we traveled. Paula in Lisbon, David at the cork factory, Maria in Evora, Sylvia and her son at the cooking school, Pablo in Seville, Concha at the bull farm, Carolina in Ronda, David in Cordoba, of whom we have no picture, Ana at the olive oil factory, Carlos in Toledo, Alberto in Madrid, and Antonio, our wonderful bus driver. Again, we have no picture. We also appreciate the wonderful and diverse group of friends who we traveled with. They were cooperative and most helpful, but especially we're grateful for Yame, for all the learnings and discoveries that he showed us, and for what he taught us with his blah, blah, blah on the bus. Thank you all so much.